Okay. And now that we've addressed a few of those questions, we can always take up more during the closing portion of this. I'm going to turn it over to Katie Horak. Um, and Katie, I just gave you control of the screen. I'm going to pull up your slide here. You should be seeing your slide.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. Again, my name is Katie Horak, and I'm with Architectural Resources Group, and I'm really very pleased to be part of this panel with Shannon and Illy. Let's see, there we go. So I'm coming at this from the consultant's perspective, from the private sector. And our role, Architectural Resources Group's role in the Mills Act is typically working under contract with cities to help them administer their programs, or working with property owners who are interested in applying to the Mills Act and wanting help with their applications. So we've worked sort of for cities and also for property owners interested in the program. We've also, we have been involved in conducting pre-approval inspections on behalf of cities in the past too. Cities often don't have the staff to do that themselves, as we've heard already. So often firms like ours will be hired to do those types of inspections. And I'm really glad that Shannon and Illy emphasized the fact that there's so much flexibility in this program. We've probably worked in around 10 communities, and every single one of those communities has an entirely different Mills Act program that's modeled on the same basic framework. And so just the caveat that my presentation is really based on my experience in those communities, and I'm sure that the other communities in the state have different programs as well. So there is a lot of flexibility in the program, which is something that I think makes it so wonderful. So the Mills Act program really just gives local municipalities the ability to incentivize historic preservation. As you've already heard, it's a giant thank you to property owners who have historic properties. And really, in many ways, it's the best financial incentive available to historic property owners. Going it's not free money, right? I mean, I think a lot of people think of this like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna get this incredible tax benefit, and I'm gonna be able to do whatever I want with that money. But that's definitely not the case. It's a contract into which a property owner enters, in which they do make a commitment to properly rehabilitate and maintain their historic properties. And the focus of my talk is going to be, how does a property owner do that? What is the work plan? And what are the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are those standards that you as representatives from planning departments or from the city will be using to evaluate work that's going on at properties that have Mills Act contracts. So I'm going to skip over the basics because Shannon and Illy did such a great job discussing these basics already, but I did want to note that all work conducted while under contract must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And as I mentioned, that's really going to be the focus of my talk. Work must also, the property must also continue to adhere to maintenance standards as well. So it must be properly maintained under the standards that the city, that local jurisdiction has provided. So an integral part of any Mills Act application is the 10-year work plan. And I have one from the city of Burbank on the right-hand side of the screen. Every city has a different work plan, but they have generally the same information on them. The work plan can include recently completed work, and that's really to show the property owner has already invested, has already made a commitment to their historic property. So you can include very recently completed work up to 18 months previously, and then you include your 10-year work plan, what work you're going to be completing every step of the way to move forward with your 10-year plan. And I was very interested to hear from Illy that Monrovia sounds like they're very hands-on, and they're establishing standards and guidelines for what should be in your work plan, but many cities just say work must adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards, and the property owners are kind of on their own to decide what those work items are going to be. So often property owners will work with a historic preservation architect to help them identify what those work items might be and whether or not they do comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards. So work items may include interior improvements, but as Illy mentioned, many cities do not include interiors. I would say probably most cities do not. Some cities do, like the city of Los Angeles, so it really just depends on which city you're living in or you're working in. The work plan must include cost estimates for all work items, so there's a value assigned to every work item. And the work item should not include work that does not constitute proper maintenance or rehabilitation of a historic property. So a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to have all this money, I'm going to build a swimming pool in my backyard. That's not necessarily a historic preservation work item, so that's not something that you would include on the 10-year work plan, or that you would approve on someone's 10-year work plan. And just another slide to show the difference in every city's 10-year work plan. This is one from Los Angeles on the left, Anaheim, and then Burbank. Every city has a different form, but they generally include the same information. So what are the Secretary of the Interior standards? I did want to go through briefly and just talk a little bit about what they are. These are the standards that you, if you are working, I think many of you work for cities, you're going to be using these standards to evaluate the work that you see on someone's work plan. You might be suggesting other work items to include on a work plan that might better adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards. So I did want to go through sort of briefly and go through each of the 10 standards that are used to evaluate the work on a Mills Act work plan. So number one, a property shall be used for its historic purpose or placed in a use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of a building. So if you have a single family house, you might not want to convert it into, I mean, you obviously have zoning regulations that would preclude this from happening, but just, you know, let's just, for instance, you might not want to turn it into a theater where you need to replace all of the load bearing or all of the walls in the interior and make it into a big open space. You want to keep, have a new use that's very similar to the historic use. It has a minimal impact to the historic character of the building. Standard number two is really a very important standard to consider as you're thinking about this work plan. And it has a lot to do with the historic character of a property, and that shall be retained and preserved. It says the removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So I think a lot of times people think, great, I'm going to have this tax benefit. This is my opportunity to replace all of my original windows, these terrible original windows that don't function anymore, and that's not the case. So a big part, oftentimes cities will require as part of the Mills Act application that there's an identification of what the character defining features of a property are, so that it's clear, okay, these are the features that must stay: original windows, original siding, doors, any other feature that is character defining really must be preserved and retained. Each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time and place. So you really don't want to, if you have a craftsman house and it's kind of plain and you really wish you had a Queen Anne house, you probably shouldn't be slapping, you know, fish scale shingles on your craftsman house because you really like the way that looks. So this is really just about not including conjectural features or architectural elements that might sort of confuse the original style of the building. Standard number four, of course, many properties change over time. Many properties in your local jurisdictions might be contributors to historic districts, and that's why they're eligible for a Mills Act. And the period of significance that they represent might be sort of broad. So for instance, this house that you see in this photograph might have been constructed in 1922, but maybe the period of significance for that district goes to 1935. And maybe that little lean-to addition that you see on the left-hand side was constructed early on within that time. So you wouldn't require them to remove that alteration. It might have gained significance in its own right because it was an early addition that occurred within the period of significance. Standard number five, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. So again, thinking about the character defining features of a property and wanting to retain all of those character defining features. And number six, deteriorated features shall be repaired rather than replaced. This is the key standard that everyone always goes back to. Just because you have windows that are in bad shape doesn't mean they can't be repaired. And I think people often are like, oh, I just want to get rid of them, they're in terrible condition. Always, always look into rehabilitating them and retrofitting them in such a way that you can preserve the original windows rather than replacing them with new windows. So these are really very key standards for a Mills Act work plan. Number 7, chemical and physical treatments such as sandblasting shall be avoided. This is a very sad photograph of a bachelor fireplace that was sandblasted. Someone thought it'd be a great idea. They wanted to take the paint off of it and restore that beautiful original glazing color, and they sandblasted it and took that glaze right off of the tile. And these tiles are now ruined. There's no way to repair them. So you definitely want to, if you're going to be repairing or restoring your bachelor fireplace, you want to consult an architectural conservator who can suggest a appropriate cleaning method for those tiles. Standard number 8 has to do with archaeological resources, which often doesn't apply to single-family houses or other properties that might be applying for Mills Act, so I'll skip over that one. And then the last 2 standards have to do with new additions and additions to buildings, alterations to buildings, related new construction in the vicinity of a historic building. So related new construction shall not destroy the historic materials that characterize the property. It should be differentiated from the old. So you hear that a lot. It should be compatible, but it shouldn't be confusing. You don't want to create an addition that looks exactly like the historic buildings that people might be confused when they see it and think, oh, is that old or is that new? I'm not sure. But it should still be conversant. It should be compatible with the historic building, but differentiated so that it appears to be contemporary. And then these new additions should be undertaken in such a way that if they were removed in the future, there would be no damage to the historic building at all. Its essential form and integrity would be unimpaired. So this example, the photograph that you see, this sort of modern box that is attached to this turn of the century house, that modern box might be easily reversible. You might be able to take that away pretty easily and the house might be unimpaired, but I wouldn't say that's a compatible addition. So a lot of times property owners will want to add to their houses when they have a Mills Act contract. They might want to add a second or a third bedroom to the back. You might be, it might be under your jurisdiction to be thinking about, okay, what would an appropriate addition be? Should be set back, it really shouldn't be visible from the street, and it definitely should meet these standards. So just briefly, I wanted to go through a quick case study. This is the Clock Tower building, or the Big Cities Guarantee building in Santa Monica. This is a building, an Art Deco building for the late 1920s, and it was awarded a Mills Act contract in 2015. Just wanted to briefly go through the documentation that the city required. This is a little bit above and beyond the standard work plan, but because this building is so big and so valuable, it's actually quite a large hit in the tax revenue that the city is getting to give it a Mills Act contract. So they really wanted to see documentation that the Mills Act really was going to good use for this property. So we did document each character defining feature of the building and document what condition it was in. So looking at painted exterior concrete, it's in fair to good condition. We identified areas of spalling and deterioration, geometric form of concrete ornamental panels, those character defining features. And then the steel frame windows, we did a window inventory of the entire building and looked at the condition of all the windows. So a takeaway from this sort of documentation for this property owner, they knew they wanted the Mills Act and they knew they had some maintenance they needed to do, but they didn't really have a big rehabilitation project in mind. The takeaway of this kind of documentation was that they had a problem with their steel windows and they really needed to do a major retrofit of all of their steel windows, which was going to be extremely expensive. So this is their 10-year work plan, which actually is quite brief. This is the rehabilitation and restoration plan, which we have separate from the maintenance plan. But the restoration of the corroded steel windows, returning them to full function and repainting all of them was almost $1 million just for that one task. It's a very big building with a lot of windows. So that, they really needed our assistance at the upfront to help them identify what those giant work items might be and identify what the costs associated with it might be as well. So in this case, we were able to do a range. They couldn't do it all at once, but they said, okay, between 2017 and 2020, we're going to restore all of these steel windows. It's going to cost this much money. They also had some roof membrane replacement and then repair of exterior concrete, which is also $250,000. So when you have a building that big, these work items are quite costly. And then their maintenance plan included recurring maintenance items. Just obviously when you own a historic building, especially a building as big and old as this one, there's recurring maintenance that needs to take place every year and it can be quite costly. So, every 3 years, repaint the chiller enclosure screen on the roof, which it has the sun beating down on it every day, washing exterior windows, maintain the operation of the historic clock, HVAC system maintenance, plumbing repairs, and recoating or maintenance of the roof coating membrane. So I should note that in Santa Monica, they do not regulate interiors. So you'll notice that all the work items that we have are exterior features or systems. So systems are technically interiors, but even if the city doesn't regulate interior features, they do, almost every city does include systems items in the work plans because those can be very costly and obviously go a long way in the proper maintenance of a historic building. So what are those items that you don't want to see on a 10-year work plan? I think you will be, many of you already do look at a lot of 10-year work plans. Some cities are much stricter than others. For instance, the city of Los Angeles has so many Mills Act contracts, and they do have a cap on their program at $2 million. They had a cap at $1 million a couple years ago or a few years ago, and they've already far exceeded that, and they're already approaching their $2 million cap. So Los Angeles is actually quite selective now regarding who they award a Mills Act contract to, and they really want to see major rehabilitation work happening on all of their Mills Act candidates. If it's just maintenance and the property is already pretty well rehabilitated and restored, they may not award the contract because they don't really see the need there. So work items that do not constitute rehabilitation, restoration, or maintenance, major new additions, that really shouldn't be your main item on your work plan, is doing a new addition to your house. The gutting of historic interior spaces, such as kitchens and bathrooms. If cities do regulate interiors, if you have an original kitchen and original bathroom, they often will want to see some retention of historic fabric, not all, obviously, but some in those spaces. And landscaping work. We've seen a lot of Mills Act applications where, the house needs a lot of work, but their biggest work item is, completely re-landscape, spending, $250,000 in re-landscaping their backyard. Cities typically don't want to see that. They want to, landscaping is fine and people should be maintaining and restoring their historic landscapes, but you probably want to prioritize the work to occur on the house or on the building itself before you start to think about landscaping. Other items, sometimes we'll see people will put regular cleaning service on their Mills Act work plans or utility bills. Those do not belong there either. You should get this kind of guidance, or as cities, you'll be giving this kind of guidance to homeowners. Sometimes they'll throw in everything by the kitchen sink, so it's, or maybe literally they're throwing in the kitchen sink, I don't know. But it's, this is the kind of thing to consider as you are reviewing these work plans. And that's it for me. So happy to answer any questions that anyone has for me or any of my fellow co-presenters.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Really appreciate that presentation. Everybody was perfectly on time. We have 12 minutes for questions. So I am going to encourage people to ask their questions through the chat box or the Q&A box now. If you would like to ask it in person, you can raise your hand. I'll pull up both the chat box and the QA box so I can keep an eye on it. And once we're done with the Q&A period, I'm going to post a link to our evaluation. So I encourage each of you to answer those questions and let us know what you'd like to see in future programs. Currently, I don't see any questions come in. So maybe I'll start off with a question of my own. And this is for all three panelists. And my question is, as Katie was presenting the example of working on the structure and not the landscape, I think my question is, how have you ever heard of any Mills Act contracts granted specifically for historic landscapes, not for any structures associated with that landscape? And is that something that happens at all?
I actually have not. I have not.
We did an application for the Village Green in Los Angeles. That certainly includes a lot of buildings, but it has more landscape than buildings.
Oh.
So we did have quite a few work items having to do with the landscape, which is extremely historic and extremely important. So that was not exclusively a landscape, but it certainly, the landscape was probably the dominant feature of that property. Also a condominium property, which is complicated for Mills Act, so that was a big one.
If I can add something to that, we did have a few properties in Monrovia who had some significant trees on the property, and they were required in their standards and conditions to preserve those trees. So but it was in addition to, of course, all the other conditions.
Great. Thanks for those examples. We did have a few other questions come in. The first question is based on any of the presenters' experiences. What other types of interior features are a part of Mills Act contracts for retention of those features?
Well, I think it just depends on the property in question. You know, often if cities do regulate interiors, they might require an inventory of character-defining features that are existent in a historic building. So there might be identification of historic plaster, cabinetry, you know, in a craftsman house, obviously lots of built-ins, things like that might be things that would be considered, you know, refinishing of historic wood, trim, cabinetry, etc. I think, you know, people always ask about bathrooms and kitchens because those are the big things that people always want to modify. And in our experience in cities, working with cities where they do regulate interiors, there's typically some flexibility there. If there are notable features, they should be retained, but I think it's kind of hard to require the owner of a historic property to keep their historic bathrooms and kitchens exactly the way, especially kitchens, but bathrooms as well.
I have tended to see any regulations on the interior in commercial spaces too, or commercial properties, or multifamily that have some public space. So I think Katie's very right when it comes to single family properties. And I haven't run into, I mean, obviously you're working directly with some local governments, but I mean, I would say statewide, most communities don't deal with the interior of a single family property. But of course, you know, if there are character defining features in a public space in a multifamily residence or a commercial space, then that's tended to be where I've experienced interior regulation or expectation.
I would agree with Shannon on that. I do believe that the commercial properties, because they are properties where the public is entering the interior, there's where you'll want to make sure that the interior is included as part of your Mills Act contract.
Okay, another question that came in was, how does the Mills Act revenue affect, or how does the Mills Act affect revenue at the state, county, and local levels? If you could give examples. And how do we, second part of the question is, how do we explain those fiscal ramifications to our city council?
Ellie, I think you're probably the best person to answer that question.
Well, as I indicated, we did keep a very good log of the tax impacts to the city. So we would provide a report every year. Keep in mind that the properties in Monrovia did not tend to be in the $1 million range like maybe some other larger cities would have. So yes, we did have fiscal impacts to the city. But again, our city council was very supportive of our historic preservation program. And as I mentioned, there are incredible economic benefits to historic preservation. And we do feel that the preservation of the homes in the town does draw some tourism to the community. I mean, you could do a whole nother presentation just on the economic benefits of historic preservation. So we just made sure that we kept very good documentations of the financial impacts.
Okay. Third question coming from Caitlin. She's asking, in a 10-year work plan, if some work is not completed but expense limits are met, can work items roll over into the next term? Or are there any penalties, and is the owner beholden to do the work that is proposed?
Real quick, let me just be clear on from a statewide perspective, there's no requirement in the act that a work plan even exists, although most local governments have gone that route, and we are definitely in favor of them because it just helps clearly define, you know, the work that will be done to restore and maintain or rehabilitate and maintain the property. But in my experience, the programs that are the most successful do have some flexibility. You know, should you be able to demonstrate that, yes, I've reinvested my property tax savings, but by year 8, I'd met my match. Now maybe I've fallen on some financial hard times or something's happened, and shoot, I'm supposed to do my roof in year 10. I think that most local governments that I've worked with anyhow, have been open to kind of working with the property owner to amend contracts. I mean, Katie and Illy, you've dealt with this more hands-on, but anecdotally, I feel like that's kind of been, the really successful communities do afford some flexibility to their property owners.
I would just add to that we did not require them in Monrovia to submit to us, here is how much money we spent on all the rehabilitation, and then compare it to the tax savings that they received. But there are some communities that do that, and that's where you're individualizing your Mills Act contract to be what works for you in your city, and what do you think the expectations of the general public will be for documentation. But for us, it did not work. We had minimal staff, and we did not require specific receipts for the works that they had done to compare to their savings.
Great answers. Katie, do you have anything to add to that, or okay?
No,
all right. One more question. Would a sewer line or electrical system replacement be allowed under a Mills Act contract?
In Monrovia, if you needed to replace your sewer, by all means, we encourage you to replace your sewer. That's just a general maintenance item that would not impact the historic significance of your home. I mean, your sewer line is underground, so yes, please replace your sewer if it's broken, by all means. And then, of course, the electrical part, we required that electrical safety inspection at the 2-year timeline on letterhead by an electrical contractor, and they looked for some of the basic things. As I mentioned, the GFI outlets where they were needed, and the property was grounded. But I mean, that's a safety issue. That's something that's very generic, and we would not include that to exclude that. I mean, we wanted to make sure that as a safety feature would be part of all of our Mills Act contracts in Monrovia.
Okay, I guess I'll close up with one more question since we have 3 more minutes, and I just saw one in the chat box, and that question is about the fees. This person is noting that some fees in Glendale are is going as high as $7,000, making it look more like a revenue source rather than a cost of administration. When does a fee become a tax, or shouldn't fees exceeding admin costs be a tax? I guess that's a matter of opinion to everybody here.
Well, I would encourage people to look at the communities that have Mills Act contract. Shannon, keeps a log of the communities in California that have adopted the Mills Act. You can go on the SHPO's website and see the list. I would click in there. I would start doing a little bit of research to see what communities are out there, and look to see what people are charging for, in our case, we would process the landmark with a Mills Act contract if they weren't already landmarked. And so we always had to justify every year that we had reasonable expenses. That is the way we did it in Monrovia. So, you'd have to look to see why cities are charging, 3, 4, 10 times more than another one, but that's the way we just did it.
Good answer, Illy.
Yes.
Hi.
I think I'll also note, just knowing what San Francisco has been doing lately, is they reassessed their Mills Act program and dropped their fees because they saw that they weren't getting as much interest in the program, and now it's resulted in much more interest, and there's much more energy behind the Mills Act program in the city. So that's something that I guess cities should look at, is balancing the fees with how much interest you want in the program.
Yeah, do not want to discourage people from coming forward. Yeah.
At some point it becomes a disincentive for sure, so.
Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to close it out. We have 1 minute, which is a whole 1 minute you can use to answer the survey that I posted in the chat box. So we like to hear what your thoughts are about our programs. And in fact, this program was made possible partly thanks to Garavalia Architecture, who was able to host me in the room today, but also thanks to our wonderful speakers today and our sponsors and our supporters and our members. So please become a member if you aren't a member. Also, a reminder is today is our final deadline. We extended the deadline for our session proposals. Every year we accept up to, I think we get as many as 60 to 70 session proposals. And programs like this don't happen without your ideas. So I do suggest and encourage everybody to go to our website, look on the right-hand side. There's a link there that encourages people to submit a session proposal, and that lets us know what you're interested in seeing in future programs. Our conference is in Pasadena next year, 2017, in May, so we hope you'll make it. Thanks again to our speakers, and I'm going to leave this chat box up, but I'm going to maybe, if I can figure out how to do it, turn off the video for everybody.
Hi guys, thank you.
And